and welcome everyone to our continuation of our 22nd year since this was founded. So we are delighted and also Happy New Year. This is our first session of the new year, and we will be following it with another 6 every other Monday ending on May 6th. So we've got an excellent program going forward for you and a wonderful one today. And that you are joining us, you certainly understand the relevance and the importance of today's program. Our goal continues to be to bring you timely analysis of world events and challenges to U.S. foreign policy. We bring you excellent speakers, as you will see in shortly. We are also delighted because this is a very special person to us also, who grew up in Chappaqua. So this is someone who was our neighbor at one point, has gone on to do many other things. Her family remains here. So we feel very close, Evelyn, to your being with us today and follow you in all your different endeavors and successes. So thank you very much for joining us. We're going to follow our usual format. Naomi Marrow is our host today, and she will be introducing you to Evelyn and giving a little bit of her background before introducing her to you. As you know, Ukraine has, I think, in a way, opened up our eyes to really a multipolar world with lots of complexity going on, and that the U.S. has a very powerful and yet not sort of has to play with a number of people, another number of countries that it has not necessarily thought that it had to be able to be successful sort of for keeping our world together. I think we've seen that trade, historical alliances, challenges to international law have all been brought out with Ukraine when Russia attacked almost a year ago. So I think this is an interesting time. We look forward to Evelyn's discussion with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Naomi Marrow.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is the pre-snowstorm edition of the Council on Foreign Relations program in Chappaqua. We again welcome Evelyn Farkas, a native of Chappaqua, as June said. Her specialty over decades has been national security and foreign policy in I was going to say all three branches of government. No, the U.S. executive and legislative branch, private sector, and international organizations overseas. She is the executive director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. Her bio just goes on and on and on. And we are going to have to end by 11 o'clock this morning. And therefore, I'm going to flip right over to Dr. Farkas to talk with us about Ukraine in our endlessly unsettled world. And I'm hoping we'll clean it up.
Well, thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Joan. Thank you to the Chappaqua Library Board, the community. Many of you may know my father was actually a library director for 20 years in the neighboring town of Briarcliff Manor. I grew up in libraries because my mother was a hospital pharmacist in what was then Grasslands, and also St. Joseph's Hospital in Yonkers and Northern Westchester Hospital. So libraries are like a second home to me. And I guess I grew up reading a lot and studying a lot. And so here I am now in a position to at least share a little bit of what I've learned through the course of my life. I also love the fact that I'm able to come back to the library virtually. In 2019, I ran unsuccessfully for Congress to represent Chappaqua among other parts of Westchester and Rockland. And at that time, I also was able to speak about foreign policy kind of in my private capacity. At that time in 2019, I believe I was saying that we are in a standoff. The United States, is the strongest democracy in the world with the autocrats of the world. At the time, however, while Russia was definitely a challenge to the international order, and we were very, very much concerned about Russia, and if Russia would prevail in Ukraine, we understood, those of us who follow international affairs, that the ramifications for the United States, for our allies, for the international order would be grave, that China would be emboldened. But we were not in as much of a perilous situation as we are today, quite frankly. Today, I would say that we are the closest to World War III that we've come to in our recent history, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's an alarming thing to say. And I say that because the world's leading democracies were facing these autocratic countries that want to destroy our democracy, take control of the international order and the rules that govern international and economic affairs. But what's truly startling is that they are now working together. They are really in an axis of evil, if you will. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran and its proxies, killing, raping, kidnapping innocent civilians, and siding with those who have committed those crimes. And those autocracies are working together in Europe, Asia, the Middle East against the United States and our allies, our interests and values. And of course, while they're doing this, all the other threats that we face on the geopolitical landscape, from nuclear proliferation and the rise of artificial intelligence to, of course, the existential challenge of climate change, only increase and compound one another. So while we're distracted by urgent threats to our way of life, of course, the irreversible danger to our very lives, and mostly I mean climate change, but also technology, AI, is growing. So we should be cooperating with all peoples on the planet to save our Earth, but we have no choice. We have to deal with the most urgent threats to our international order, to our peace, to our economic prosperity, and to our way of life. And Russia is indeed the most urgent of these. The Russian government, Vladimir Putin, has decided that the United States, as the largest strongest economic, political, and diplomatic power in the world, of course, together with its allies, which makes us even more powerful, is the only nation and the only alliance that would stop Russia in terms of Vladimir Putin's objectives. Vladimir Putin, it has been very open about it, especially since the full frontal invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. His goal is to destroy the international order, to recreate a neo-imperial and imperial Russia, if you will, to take the former Soviet states back under the control of the Kremlin, under Moscow's control, to exercise influence throughout Eastern Europe. And frankly, he would destroy NATO. And that is why Russia is so dangerous to us today. NATO, we understand NATO is a collective alliance where we have determined that we would go to the assistance if one of the nation states is attacked. The Article 5 collective defense provision of the treaty that created NATO has only been invoked once. That was to protect the United States after 9/11. But we are watching very warily, because if Russia prevails in Ukraine, if Vladimir Putin gets his way, he will turn to NATO and try to test our Article 5 resolve. And if we don't come to the rescue of our allies, so if he probes Poland or one of the Arctic states militarily, then NATO, in essence, will be destroyed. Our political will is what makes us strong, what makes us able to carry through, what makes us able to deter Russia, and then, of course, defend ourselves. If we lack political will, Russia will continue doing what it has been doing, which is attacking us directly. Make no mistake, the Russian government is attacking the United States every day through social media, through the internet, through all kinds of false claims. You only need to look at the latest interview that Tucker Carlson did in Russia with Vladimir Putin. There's also a high degree of economic influence that Russia exerts. Some of it is still unseen through bribery, through corruption, through pressure that Russia exerts on our politicians and others. And of course, throughout the history of Europe, there's been a lot of pressure exerted on European countries, economic pressure, primarily in the oil and gas industries. So the reality is that Russia has made its objectives very clear to us. The cost has been great. Russia invaded the Republic of Georgia in 2008. This is really when it started showing its more aggressive face. And Russia continues to occupy 20% of Georgia's territory. It then, of course, in 2014 invaded Ukraine, seized Crimea. That was the first time that an international boundary had been essentially erased using military force since Hitler seized Austria in the beginning of World War II. So again, we are in a truly dangerous situation, but for Russia, that wasn't enough. They started a war also in another part of eastern Ukraine. When that did not result in Putin getting real control over Ukraine, he started 2 years ago the full frontal invasion, which has not succeeded. But again, I want to make sure that I make it really clear that if we don't support Ukraine, if we don't defeat Vladimir Putin and his aggressive foreign policy in a really blatant fashion, meaning Vladimir Putin probably needs to be removed from power, because any kind of ceasefire is not going to be tenable. We know what his objective is. It's control over Ukraine, as I said, and then also Republic of Georgia, all the former Soviet territory, and again, the destruction of NATO, or the deep weakening of NATO at a minimum. So if Vladimir Putin stays in power, he will continue to pose a threat to Ukraine and to us. And again, if Ukraine is defeated, not only will NATO be challenged, but China will be watching. And China has been very aggressive since President Xi came to power in 2012. China has been challenging the disputed territories in the South China Sea. They have been building up island rocks into bases, in essence, and they have been harassing, in particular, our Philippine and Vietnamese allies and partners using their maritime forces. This is a real challenge to the international order, to freedom of navigation, to commerce. I, of course, don't need to add to the list of what other countries are doing, and of course, what Iran is doing right now, emboldened, frankly, by the fact that Russia has been able to get away with what it's been doing. Perhaps Iran and Russia also were behind the scenes collaborating in terms of the attack on the Israeli citizens coming from Gaza. We will maybe find out at some point whether they colluded or not with the Hamas terrorists, whether they directed the timing really doesn't matter as much as the fact that clearly Russia and Iran are benefiting from the horrendous attack on Israel. What is happening in Israel today is drawing attention away from the situation in Ukraine. We are forced in the United States to consider an aid package, not just to Ukraine, but to Israel now, and of course to Taiwan. So all of I think the point that I want to make, even though this speech and this conversation is about Ukraine, is that all of these things are interconnected. And so the stakes are indeed, they were always high in Ukraine, but I think it should be much more obvious to Americans today that the stakes are truly global. And if we don't stop this kind of aggressive attack on our international order being posed by Russia, which again wants to go back to a sphere of influence system, wants to dismantle the whole United Nations and the rule of law that we established after World War II to make sure that we wouldn't have a third world war, that if we don't succeed in stopping Russia from doing that, then we will indeed be in a much more dangerous world. And China, while China doesn't want to completely dismantle the United Nations, what they would like to do is put the emphasis on the borders and encourage the international community and push the international community to ignore human rights and what happens inside the borders of countries. And I, as the executive director of the McCain Institute, obviously vehemently oppose such a change, such a shift in international policy. Senator McCain was famous for espousing the rights of individuals to have freedom, whether they lived in a democracy or not, frankly. And he spoke out on behalf of political dissidents all over the world. Today, he would be speaking out very loudly on behalf of his friend, his pallbearer friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is wrongfully imprisoned in Russia, missing, we think, in Siberia, in poor health because he's been poisoned twice by the Russians. And he's in prison basically because he called the Russian attack, the full frontal assault on Ukraine, a war. So that is a little bit of a scene setter for you all. I really don't like kind of lecturing at people. I can give you lots of examples of, egregious things that the Russian government has done in terms of the impact on Ukraine, on Syria, on Chechnya of this aggressive foreign policy. I can certainly also talk about what China has done, everything from stealing our technical secrets, our intellectual property, all the way back to, as I mentioned, their militaristic foreign policy, their attempt to gain influence globally in developing parts of the world, like in Africa and in Latin America, which poses a threat to us again, because President Xi has been very clear that his desire is not only to rewrite the rules of the international order, but to subvert the United States as the #1 political, economic, and military power. And China is not as interested in cooperation as they were under previous presidents. So I think the ramifications, I would maybe just add one other point about technology, because oftentimes people miss the fact that while in the United States, yes, we have lots of debates about the use of technology and how technology should impact our society. Because we are a democracy, we have these debates, and because we are a democracy, the use of technology must be balanced with privacy, with the rights of individuals. But in states like China, right now, the People's Republic of China essentially is like a big prison system with cameras everywhere, with no freedom, no privacy, or very little privacy. And the Chinese people, especially in Hong Kong, we know they can no longer rise up again. The state will detect any attempt to rise up. So probably if any change is going to come in China, it will have to come on the mainland. So I veered off a little bit from Ukraine, but I think it is really important to understand that Ukraine is not a foreign policy issue in and of itself. It's truly a global issue. The Ukrainians are fighting for democracy, for sovereignty, not just for themselves, but they're fighting for the security on the European continent and beyond that, because all of these autocrats are working together. They gain strength from one another. Just look at Viktor Orban, the Hungarian not democratic leader, coming here to the United States about a year or so ago, talking about how you can subvert democracy, his recipe for moving from a democracy to an illiberal democracy, which of course, as we know, is not a democracy at all. So with that, I think I would, if these wonderful hosts allow me, I'll go to Q&A. And if people don't have enough Q&A, I know what people usually ask, and I'm happy to jump in and pretend that somebody asked about India or something else. So with that, I will turn it over to Naomi.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you so much. A couple of things. One, there was an article in the Times yesterday about Russia making footsteps into Finland. And Finland has always been very alert to whether the bear was coming over the border. And now they're even more concerned, as is Estonia and other countries. Two, sanctions don't seem to work. I'm not saying they should be off the table by any means, but what other forms of pressure slash downright intimidation can we use that have shown effect?
Mm-hmm. So with regard to Finland, yes, so this is one of the victories, frankly, that we achieved since the full frontal invasion of Ukraine. Over time, so I was in the Pentagon working for President Obama, responsible for the Department of Defense policy towards Russia, Ukraine, and 12 other countries in the Baltics, in Eastern Europe. And at the time, our European allies were at different stages of awakening, if you will, or full comprehension of Vladimir Putin's aims. And I do think that he also became much more emboldened and much more clear about his objectives sort of coming out of COVID. And there's a lot of literature on that, a lot of analysis of his thinking and who was advising him. But many countries still, like Sweden and Finland, thought that they could manage the relationship with Russia, that Russia wouldn't be a direct military challenge. having said that, in 2022, when Russia launched the full frontal blatant invasion together with the horrendous human rights, and I have all this statistics on the human rights, but the hundreds of children being kidnapped and moved into Russia. For that, Vladimir Putin has been, there's a warrant out for his arrest at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. In addition to that, of course, we know that the Russians raped, murdered, tortured innocent civilians, women, children, and that this is still ongoing. They have been deliberately targeting civilians as part of this part of the military campaign, unlike the war that they launched in 2014. And this was just shocking to certainly our European allies watching this happen in their front yard or their backyard, whatever in their neighboring yard. And it's just something that we had thought we had essentially put guardrails around, that it wouldn't happen again after World War II. That's why we, wrote the Geneva Conventions. That's why we established the United Nations. And so Finland and Sweden, while they had been clinging to the idea, again, that their neutrality or their ability to relate to, work with, talk to Russia would protect them, they suddenly realized that this was no longer the case. And so what Vladimir Putin got in exchange for that horrendous invasion of Ukraine, in part, was a very strong, resolute NATO, and a NATO that expanded to encompass Finland, which has a very long border with Russia. And the Finns have always they've maintained a strong independent defense. They were colonized, they were conquered by the Russian empire. For about 100 years they were occupied. So when you hear Vladimir Putin talking, as he has recently, about going back and looking at property that the Russian empire once held, and having his diplomats catalog those properties, one of those properties is the country of Finland. So that is another kind of battle cry and a saber that Putin is rattling at Finland. And then, of course, Sweden. In the 2013, 14, 15, maybe later, maybe 15, 16 timeframe, as the New York Times describes, the Russians did weaponize refugees. They brought refugees to the border between Russia and Finland and essentially pushed the refugees across the border to create a problem for Finland. They just conducted another refugee push, and that's what the New York Times was covering. And it's caused problems for Finland. The Russians, of course, very cleverly do this right on the eve of Finland's presidential elections. The outgoing Finnish president was very strong. He understood Russia. He had a strong perspective on Russia. He was, for a long time, an interlocutor with Vladimir Putin until he realized that he couldn't speak, if you will, sense to Vladimir Putin. But he has been a very good resource and a great leader for the Finnish people. So the Russians, of course, are trying to influence the Finnish elections. This, I think, the Finns will be able to handle. They are probably the best country when it comes to dealing with disinformation. That's another New York Times article that you can look up, looking at how, starting in elementary school, Finnish youth are educated about how to detect disinformation and how to read critically. So I think the Finnish example is startling because, again, it shows you the lengths to which Russia will go to try to influence a democratic process, to try to create instability in Europe, and the very real threat to NATO. We now have a requirement to also defend Finland if Putin were to conduct any kind of military attack on Finland. So while Finland makes us stronger because it's also a threat against Russia, the threat goes the other way. But it is, of course, also a requirement now. So I think we just need to sort of keep an eye on what's happening in Finland and remind Russia that Finland is a member of NATO. I will say that Vladimir Putin is not stupid. He does not want a war with NATO. He wants to challenge NATO in a way that NATO will appear weak and, miraculously crumble. I don't think that will happen. And I do think he has a healthy respect for NATO as a military force, and certainly the United States as a military force. With regard to sanctions, Yeah, sanctions never really work in terms of full-on change of a government's policy. I think probably even in the South African case where, sanctions ultimately, you can argue, contributed to the government changing and the apartheid system crumbling, it wasn't probably the only thing that caused that to happen. And in this case, sanctions are part of a strategy to weaken Russia, to deny from Russia, frankly, economic resources as much as possible. The most impactful, I think, measure that we've taken is not necessarily sanctions, but diverting our sourcing. So the Europeans now receive oil and gas not from Russia, but from other sources. And if necessary, now the Russian oil and gas is capped price-wise, but the sanctions have not denied Russia all of its economic resources. Part of that is because there are countries that have stepped in to take advantage of the lower prices and to buy the oil that the Europeans are no longer buying from Russia. So those countries include India, which I consider a fence-sitting country, a country that doesn't want to take the side of democracies, even though India is ostensibly a democracy. Or it is on the books a democracy, but India prefers to not take a side, has a long history of being non-aligned politically during the Cold War, and has a history of working with Russia. So India has kind of straddled the line, although India is very much not friendly with China. There's an adversarial relationship there, including a war that's been small skirmish war that's been fought on in recent years on the border between India and China. So China and Russia are clearly aligned. They call each other strategic partners. India has still a relationship with Russia, but a friendly one, but an adversarial one with China. And then, of course, we've tried to draw India in closer, but it's one of those countries that's helping Russia, in essence, evade sanctions because India is buying oil from Russia. China, of course, is as well. There are other things we can and should do to clamp down on Russia. Some of the sanctions, have been expanded to other sectors like diamonds. And aside from sanctions, frankly, I think the most effective thing we can do is, again, deter Russia by strengthening Ukraine, strengthening the NATO countries' military capabilities so that Russia, first of all, recognizes that it can't win in Ukraine, but probably will have to help the Ukrainians inflict more damage on the Russian military. And then, of course, anything we can do to squeeze them economically, but sanctions are not going to be the thing that breaks the camel's back, if you will.
Yeah, I think you're saying there is no one thing. It's the combination of several and changing the balance over time opportunistically.
Yeah.
What about the issue of corruption in Ukraine, which many of our politicians return to as the no, we should not give them more money?
Right. So, look, corruption is a problem in every country that has humans in it. So we're not without corruption here. But Ukraine does have a history of robust corruption. President Zelensky came to power in order to essentially clamp down on corruption. First he said I'm going to bring peace and I'm going to address corruption. He did not bring peace, of course, through no fault of his own. And on corruption, I think there have been advances, but there's still a lot to be done. And I do think it's important to continue to remind the Ukrainians that they need to keep working on corruption, because a prerequisite of NATO membership, of course, is having a democracy that's not corrupt, having an economic system with transparency. And so the Ukrainians, they have a strong, robust civil society. They have a strong commitment within their society to fighting corruption. I have, been working in and around Ukraine since the 90s, and I've never seen such a dedication, such a commitment right now as what we have right now. But, it really, in order to continue to make serious progress fighting corruption, the war has to come to an end, because the war does concentrate power, whether we like it or not, in the central government, which then is a temptation for corruption. And it's also a little bit of the way things were in the past. So, you know, for Ukraine, the best scenario is to defeat Russia as soon as possible, or to have a tenable peace. But again, a tenable peace would require another leader in the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin, we know, and the Ukrainians would never believe that he would want, that he would agree to any kind of ceasefire. Vladimir Putin has imperialist aims, and so it would take a more pragmatic leader in the Kremlin to convince the Ukrainians that what Russia wants is a real ceasefire. So I'm now Naomi, answering a question that hasn't been asked but often gets asked.
June, you have questions in the Q&A?
Sure. We do. In answer to the first question, we have about 60 people who are registered online, so that means watching now. We also pick up, it depends somewhat on the program, but we can pick up another 100 plus people. Sometimes as many as 150 will come on. So we have actually a very wide audience. Zooming has certain advantages for our program, which is that we're able to talk to Evelyn, who's now in Washington. We've spoken to people who are actually even out of this country. So Zooming has advantages. Of course, it's not the same as having Evelyn with us live in Chappaqua. I think there's an energy that comes out of in person, but there is also the ability now to have her knowledge that she can share with us and be somewhere else. So pluses and minuses. The other question I think that we're all is sort of gnawing away with us is, why is it that everyone does not understand? In fact, what you are hoping for is that they understand in this country the significance of our position in Ukraine, and also what happens then if Trump is elected.
Yeah, I mean, it's curious to me why people don't fully grasp this. I think for some people, it's just that they don't understand the history. You have to really fully understand the world history. I think even in the context when we talk about what is going on in the Middle East right now, you have to understand what's going on, going all the way back to, you know, the British occupation of Palestine, and, you know, what is now the territory of the state of Israel, and of course of the Palestinian people in Jordan. And so you have to kind of understand history in order to understand where we are today. And certainly when it comes to Europe, that history has been contained by the rules of the road, by the international order that said you can't change boundaries using military force, which, as I said, is exactly what Putin did in 2014. And that is the fact that Putin did that in Crimea is shocking to people who understand history. The fact that Putin then went and weaponized, you know, rape and torture and against innocent civilians is, again, something that we would understand if in the context of history, because that's something that we essentially, you know, tried to prohibit through the Geneva Conventions. So I think that people in the United States, perhaps, you know, if they have a better understanding of history, of world history, especially of European history, then they would be able to identify a pattern and understand, okay, this is a neo-imperial leader. This guy, Putin, is akin to Hitler. He's not going to stop. In fact, he's more emboldened by weakness. If we show a strong front and tell him he has to back down, he will. He's made lots of threats, you know, dangled the nuclear saber, you know, essentially said, reminded people that he is a nuclear power in order to try to prevent, for example, Ukrainians from attacking Russian forces in Crimea. Well, when the Ukrainians attacked Russian forces in Crimea, Putin did not launch a nuclear missile or nuclear weapon. So again, what we found out was that if you were strong and you ignored Putin's threats, then he would back down. He's backed down in other instances as well. So, you know, it is really important to study how this type of leader has functioned in the past and to pay attention. He has, you know, very openly stated what his objectives are. And the reality is that many countries chose to ignore it. In the case of our own system, I think many Americans don't really understand the difference between, and I should say probably younger Americans, again, getting back to the knowledge of history, the difference between democracy and autocracy, what it feels like to live in a democracy versus a non-democracy. And as somebody who's the child of Hungarian political refugees who fled communism, but I had grandparents living in Hungary, so we would leave Chappaqua and go, we didn't go to like Boca like my classmates did. We would go to Hungary, and we couldn't even afford to do that very often. And when we went there, when we visited my grandmother, I remember as a 10-year-old, my parents saying, shh, be quiet, the lady next door is the spy, and she's going to tell on your grandparents if you say the wrong thing, and they're going to get in trouble. And I knew at the time that trouble in a non-democracy involved police and jail, and sorry about my dog. And so, understanding the difference between what it is to live in a democracy versus living in a non-democracy is something that you probably you can get out of books and novels, and then you can get by visiting those places. But of course, we don't want our youth to go visiting places where they might be in danger, but you can go visit a place like Vietnam and see what the difference is between democracy and a country that's not quite as free. That's a communist country still.
And I think the other question was, what would happen if Trump were to be elected? What would happen to NATO?
Yeah. Look, I have friends who worked in the Trump administration. On our board, we have a friend of mine, Mark Esper, who has very clearly said that Trump was a danger to the United States and our national security interests, and that if he got into power again, he would continue to be a danger, and perhaps at a higher level, because he wouldn't have people like Mark Esper, General Mattis, and others kind of reining him in. And he has been very clear. I mean, he says things like, I'll be a dictator on day one. If you're a dictator on day one, then you're willing to be a dictator on day two. Why would you give that up, on day two? What he said this past weekend about NATO members is outrageous and also really dangerous. It's dangerous right now because we are trying to deter Vladimir Putin from taking any action against NATO countries. If he looks at what Trump said and thinks, well, I'm going to attack NATO, he could try now and think, well, maybe the US is divided because all these people support Donald Trump. So maybe I'll just go, send some forces into Poland and see what NATO does, right? We will respond and then we'll be in a war. And again, that's another reason why we want to bring the war in Ukraine to an end decisively so that we can reduce the risk that we'll be at war with Putin. But if he feels emboldened by Trump's comments this weekend, which I'm sure he does, and certainly if Trump were to win, he would be even more emboldened, then that's a direct danger to our interests, and certainly we would have to take action. So I cannot underscore how dangerous Donald Trump would be to our foreign policy, to our national security interests, to our way of life. And I'm leaving aside even the domestic components of this argument. Senator McCain was very clear about how he felt about Donald Trump's view of the world. He and people like myself, we believe that America, as the strongest economic, political, and military power, number one, has a responsibility to protect not just our democratic way of life, but to protect human rights for others, even in non-democracies, and to create security and stability, and as much as possible, prosperity for others. And second, that we, in essence, we have that responsibility, but even if we didn't have that responsibility, because we are the most powerful state in the world, we know that it's unrealistic to be isolationist, to think that the bad guys won't come for us. We are a target because of our power. We are a target because we can lash out. We can stop people like Vladimir Putin. We can stop President Xi. And so they want to weaken us. They're not going to just let us sit here in our splendid isolation. They will try to take us down because they perceive us as a potential threat or a real threat.
So Evelyn, of course, this is always the problem, that you're talking to the people who, more or less, I would think, agree with you. So we're not reaching, I guess, those people who are supporting Trump. So that the election looks like it could be so close is really quite terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, he's clearly a populist, neo-fascist leader. He appeals to people who want somebody else to worry about security, want some sort of solution, perhaps, are aggrieved because they don't like the changes that have been happening in our society. There are, as we know, all kinds of different people who are, for different reasons, supporting former President Trump and his quest to get another term. But, I think, as Liz Cheney would say, we want serious people in office, and populists are not serious. They're all about themselves, and they use their followers. We know that Donald Trump basically is taking money from his followers every day. And while there are some business types who support Trump, I think very naively believing that Trump will somehow help the economy. But it's important to understand that Donald Trump doesn't believe in rule of law, and he believes in picking winners and making losers. All you have to do is think back to when he was targeting the Carrier air conditioning company back, oh gosh, years ago when he was in office. He liked to pick the winners and, like I said, make losers. And that's not how capitalism works. That's not how a free economy works. The rule of law protects all people who are endeavoring to build a business, to make a profit. And if there is no rule of law, then our entire prosperity will also be in question. So, hanging in the balance. So it's not just about our political system per se, but these things are intertwined. The rule of law not only protects our freedoms as individuals, but it also protects businesses.
If you were in Jake Sullivan's office, member of his team, what would you recommend the administration do to further convince Putin not to take extensive risks against democracies?
Yeah, I mean, what I would do is, of course, what's not in their power right now, because it's in Congress's power, which is to provide robust, immediate assistance to Ukraine. I think if I were there, I would also put American advisors into Ukraine. When I was in the administration, we did have Americans in the western part of Ukraine, training Ukrainians, and not just Americans. I mean, all the NATO countries were in there helping train them, and it was safe, and it was also, frankly, a signal to Russia: don't try anything. I would actually put more Americans in. Our embassy also is not. The footprint is very small. It's still very much, I think, too cautious. I would put in more military advisors to help the Ukrainians. And I would consider what we might do. In a different phase of this war, I had called for providing air support to Ukraine. But certainly, if there's anything we can do under the existing authorities to accelerate or to provide indirect support to Ukraine or to NATO allies that are willing to be more forward-leaning. So the Baltic states, they were always willing to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine well before any of the other countries were. So we might think about what we can do to support other nations, provide them with weaponry, so that they then could transfer either weaponry or maybe direct support to Ukraine. We have to be careful, because we don't want to encourage, we want to make sure that what we do deters Putin and doesn't escalate. So the administration has been keeping that in mind, but I think I would argue they have been a bit too cautious and not creative enough. The other thing I would do, Naomi, is to look at other places where, Putin, like I said, the attack in Gaza, maybe the exact date wasn't something that was picked by Tehran and Moscow, but the reality of it is helpful to them, right? And so geopolitically. And so therefore, I think we also might think about, well, what can we do that would be unhelpful to Russia, geopolitically? And I'm not saying we use military action or conduct a barbaric invasion, a la the Gaza terrorists, but something that we could do to kind of throw Putin off balance. I think we should be more creative along those lines. And I do think pushing back, getting a diplomatic solution in the Middle East would also help, because we need to shift the focus back to Russia, and I mean, we need to stop the bloodletting in Gaza and in the Middle East.
Peter, you had a question.
Yes, thanks so much for all these remarks. I'd like to go back a little bit to the notion of what tools or other levers we might have, particularly at this time when members of Congress can't get off the dime. One of the points is Russian assets, which are under the control of Euroclear or other countries. And there's a big debate going on about whether we should either seize them or use them as collateral for loans, which could directly aid Ukraine. What is your view on that?
I'm all for any and all of those creative methods. I'm for Senator Whitehouse has something they call the Repo Act. It's capital REPO, but very clever. It's for the reconstruction is probably the R in it, using the money not for the weaponry but for rebuilding. It's basically restitution. Like the Russians, you destroyed Ukraine. We're going to use your money to rebuild Ukraine. And I think it would hold up in an international court. So I think we should be more forward-leaning, more aggressive, using those resources. Of course, there are different variants on this. Some will say just use the interest. If you want to start that way, fine. I think that there's a little too much lawyering in deciding among the various options. It's clear that Russia launched an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine that then resulted in an assault on Ukrainian civilians, on civilian infrastructure. And the Ukrainians, I was there in October with something we have at the McCain Institute called the Ukraine Business Alliance, where we bring their defense tech and tech companies that we bring around a table to work on supporting Ukraine. They're already in Ukraine, countries like Microsoft and Amazon and Palantir and Google, and many of these are working for free, frankly. But when we went there, we found that the technology in Ukraine was so advanced that they could probably give out also restitution payments pretty quickly. And in fact, one of our, I think it was Skydio, the drone company that was with us, a relatively small defense tech company, they said, we could team up with you, and if you get a claim, we could send a drone over and do a surveillance and come back and tell you, yes, indeed, what farmer so-and-so told you, or what the cafe owner told you about what happened to his or her cafe or farmland is accurate, and yes, you should give X amount of money for them to rebuild. So there's a lot that could be done even right now while the war is ongoing, using that money.
Thank you. If I could just follow up one point. You're right there in Washington. You must be seeing members of Congress, staff. What is it like when you try to talk with some of the opponents about the concerns and the dangers that you've described so well?
Well, unfortunately, the way it works in Washington, you don't really interact that much with the opponents directly. We kind of are dealing with, so at the McCain Institute, we're dealing with people who have our same perspective. So they might be Republicans or Democrats, but they're all very much in support of assistance to Ukraine. I will be going to Munich with the congressional delegation. And there it is interesting because there will be people on that delegation like Senator J.D. Vance, like Senator Graham, who supports Ukraine, but then didn't vote for legislation on the border where he was negotiating on it. So anyway, people who have a different perspective, maybe not on Ukraine per se, but there's a little nuance there with Senator Graham, but with Senator Vance, for sure, he's on the other side
Right.
on this issue. So it will be interesting to see. You know, I think most people will politely try to, you know, avoid people like that. I think they just don't understand you know, it's a political argument that they make based on, I mean, they appear to be motivated by a desire to do whatever Donald Trump wants or to avoid getting in trouble with Donald Trump and his voters. The arguments that, you know, Senator Vance puts forward don't really carry any water. So as I said, we can't be isolationists, and the amount of money Senator Graham himself has said, you know, about 3% of the annual defense budget has been utilized by the United States in order to degrade Russia's military to about half its strength before the full frontal invasion, or certainly you can go back to 2014. And Russia is the #1 adversary of NATO, so it's been a pretty good bargain. So the arguments that you hear from the other side, which are isolationist arguments, they just don't carry water. But I think, yeah, I think there are not that many people that we come in contact with on a day-to-day basis. It's very hard to change minds if people are motivated not by the logic of the argument, but by a political desire to maintain, you know, maintain the allegiance of, or the allegiance of people who are committed in their hearts, I guess, to Donald Trump.
Thank you.
Evelyn, so the comments about the U.S. supporting militarily with weaponry Israel and Ukraine is depleting our stashes that are necessary for our defense. Is that a lot of hot air from your estimation, or?
So so Naomi, there's truth to it because we are taking from our stocks to provide Ukraine with assistance. But remember, the #1 threat to us right now is Russia. Yes, China is an adversary, and we have to keep an eye on China because perhaps she might decide to use military force to capture Taiwan, and in that case, we may go to Taiwan's assistance. It's, you know, unclear exactly what we would do. That would be, we're not treaty bound to Taiwan, which we have not recognized as an independent state, nor do we want Taiwan to declare its independence. And President Biden and all of his predecessors have been clear on that. So the Chinese threat is not that great. I mean, there is a threat that there could be a military standoff, let's say, between China. Well, China and the Philippines might actually be one where we would have to come to the aid of the Philippines because of our defense relationship with them, and certainly Japan and South Korea. So there is some danger with China, but that would be more inadvertent. And the Russia one is a real everyday acute risk. And you know, Russia's not going to go away, so we need to manage that. And now I've forgotten what the original question was about it. Oh, I know, depleting our resources. So we're depleting our resources by having Ukraine fight our #1 most urgent threat. Having said that, we do need to ramp up production. We do have a situation where our defense industrial base has, you know, kind of atrophied from Cold War levels, and we're now in a place where we're facing like another Cold War. So we do need to ramp up our production capability. We've had a lot of consolidation in the defense industry, which means also there's less competition. We've had assembly lines close. One thing that my conservative colleagues have been trying to point out to the senators in red states where munitions are manufactured, including Ohio, including Jim Jordan's district, and of course, J.D. Vance's state, is the fact that, frankly, US businesses and US workers are actually benefiting also from, the unfortunate war that Ukraine has to fight, because we have ramped up the production. So there is also, a benefit, if you will.
And the economic implications of more and more, many more billions of dollars going overseas, although a lot of it is just, as you said, going into our own production. How much economically can we afford, and where will that money come from vis-a-vis taking it from other programs? That's a real political.
Well, so first of all, again, the amount of money that we give to Ukraine is very small in the grand scheme of our budget, and it is mostly for the military component of Ukraine's struggle. There is some economic assistance, yes, that we give Ukraine, but the Europeans bear most of the responsibility there, and they have been glad to shoulder that. They recently approved about $50 billion or 50 billion euros of assistance, economic assistance to Ukraine. And of course, they also provide military assistance bilaterally, with the Brits providing, and they're not even in the EU anymore, but they're also providing significant capabilities, meaning longer range missiles, which have been key in Ukraine regaining control of the Black Sea waters that are Ukrainian. So meaning they have been able to reestablish trade through the Black Sea, the Ukrainians have, because of British weaponry. So I think that we are far from that. That's not our economic challenge. The economic challenge for the United States is frankly the money that we are spending on healthcare, on Social Security, the need to probably revamp Social Security, probably raise the ages, and we need to achieve efficiencies in our overall economy. Having said that, I do think that there's always waste when it comes to the Defense Department budget, and so we could trim some of our spending away from some of the legacy, what we call platforms, planes, ships, and vehicles. There probably is some cost savings that could be achieved. Certainly the high tech capabilities, they tend to cost less and take less time to manufacture. We could do more along those lines. Again, our defense industry is constructed to minimize risk, but that minimization of risk, which is important, it also comes with a lot of cost. And then, of course, we have kind of what President Eisenhower famously called the defense industrial complex, which pushes back on cuts. But there could be some reallocation of funds. But ultimately, the money that we spend on assistance to other countries, whether it's military assistance or foreign economic assistance, food assistance, all of that helps us create a safer, more stable world. And the argument is that if it's a safer, stable world, then we have fewer challenges to our borders. We have more regulated immigration. We have less crisis and conflict around the world. And that's all before you factor in, as I said, the changes to the climate, which is going to make everything even harder, is already making everything harder.
Can I get one more question? Because there is a question on Orban, which is how dangerous is he to us, who we do consider an ally of sorts?
Well, yeah, so Hungary is a member of NATO, so we are treaty bound to defend Hungary. But Hungary is not a liberal democracy, as Orban himself has said. It's very hard for the opposition to exercise any kind of real challenge to Orban because of what he's done to the judiciary as well as the media. Although, as we saw in Poland, where there was a similar dynamic, the opposition can, if it wants to, and if it gets organized, assert effective competition and retake power. And that's what happened in Poland, although largely because the previous administration went too far in trying to restrict abortion rights of women. And so the Polish women said, okay, enough. They kind of woke up to the previous government's restrictions on freedom. In Hungary, we have a country that is, kind of an enemy from within, because Orban himself has said he views Ukraine as a border state, not a real state. He agrees with Vladimir Putin on many things, and he has all kinds of economic entanglements with Putin over nuclear power, over oil and gas. And he's incredibly corrupt, Orban is, and has allowed himself to be corrupted by Vladimir Putin and his colleagues. Orban has tried to hold up assistance, has held up assistance to Ukraine within the EU context, and has also tried to do so within NATO. Ultimately, he has not, prevailed. He has not succeeded. But every time he does something like that, it does make us look weak. And Putin, of course, relishes that. Orban, my hope is that the Hungarian people will at some point, challenge him, that the opposition will launch a concerted effort to remove him from office through elections, and that they'll win. But right now, my understanding is that the opposition is pretty disorganized, and Orban is very organized. But again, I think that, just as I said, the autocratic countries gain strength from one another and from the examples of success. If one of them has success, then the others all kind of gain strength from that and collude. I think for someone like Orban, if he sees, for example, Trump defeated, then he will retreat, and he will be less emboldened. If, however, he sees progress, if he sees an autocrat or an autocratic type like Trump making progress, he will take strength from that, and he will be more brazen.
Thank you.
We had a request, if there are any particular websites or research that you would recommend that we pass along to our viewers, we would be grateful. So we can do that after this session.
Yeah.
But I think we are past.
I would say McCainInstitute.org. We focus on defending democracy and human rights and creating character-driven leaders. There are opportunities for young people to serve as virtual or in-person junior fellows. We have global leaders programs. And I think our programming in general, some of it is virtual. It would be interesting to your audience, and I would encourage them to sign up to get our emails. Aside from that, if you want to follow Ukraine, there are the Institute for the Study of War does a very good job kind of on how's Ukraine doing on the war. I'm trying to think what other good sources there are. I mean, my husband is always looking at the Ukrainian sources, Ukrainska Pravda or Kiev Independent in English. And sometimes, you have to kind of look at it through the lens of, this is a Ukrainian, journal, but sometimes they report on things before our journalists can verify and look at things. So you have to know whether it's verified or not, but you may find out about something before others do.
You have been wonderful, and we very much appreciate your taking this time with all the demands on you. And I hope you'll come and visit us in Chappaqua soon.
Oh yeah, I'm always there, but I need to go to the library more often.
Let us know when you come, and we'll go and have lunch with you.
Right.
So I want to thank everybody. We will have another program February 25. We will have Ken Pollack talking to us on Israel and the ramifications of the war in Gaza. So please join us then. And thank you again, Evelyn.
Hey, thank you all. Thank you, Evelyn. And thank
And
you,
Margaret,
Planning
thank you.
Committee.